Hey, it's Patricia Murphy. It's Monday. It's a new year. And this is Seattle Now. He's been called the most important Native American activist of his generation, but he preferred his historical archives to the spotlight, so most of us have never heard of Hank Adams. We'll remember him in a minute, but first, let's get you caught up. King County's health officer is calling a contagious new COVID strain a serious problem. He says it's only a matter of time until it's found here. Dr. Jeff Duchin says the new variant doesn't appear to be any more deadly, but it does spread more easily. And while he thinks vaccines will still be highly effective against it, Duchin is warning people to not let their guard down so that a surge in new cases doesn't overwhelm hospitals. Sailors aboard a Bremerton-based aircraft carrier are not leaving the Middle East waters as planned. The USS Nimitz was ordered out of the area on New Year's Eve by Acting Defense Secretary Christopher Miller. Late Sunday, though, Miller cited new threats against President Trump made by Iranian leaders and ordered a stop to the redeployment. And a pair of Seahawks made some team history in yesterday's win over the 49ers. Wide receiver DK Metcalf eclipsed Hall of Famer Steve Largent for most receiving yards in a season. Wide receiver Tyler Lockett broke his own record for most catches. Seahawks finish up 12-4. They'll start the playoffs at home next weekend against the LA Rams, who they just beat a week ago.
The late Hank Adams has been described as the, quote, most important Indian in the United States. A 77-year-old Native American rights activist passed away in Olympia on December 21st, and yet you probably haven't heard of him before. Mark Trahant is editor at Indian Country Today, and he's here to talk about the life of Hank Adams. Mark, welcome.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
You wrote a story on Hank Adams. And you did list that title I mentioned there, the most important Indian. How exactly do you get a nickname like that?
Well, and where it came from was Vine Deloria Jr., who was probably the most important Native American, at least in the 20th century. I think it came about because Vine recognized that Hank Adams was the strategist behind a lot of the activism that occurred, particularly in the last half of the 20th century.
Let's talk a little bit about that history there. I think to understand why Hank Adams was so important, you have to know a little bit of that. And I grew up in this region, and I have to admit that I was pretty ignorant to a lot of this history, some of what is known as the Fish Wars. Could you set us up a little bit of that picture? What exactly were the Fish Wars?
Sure, and this goes back to the 1850s when the Pacific Northwest was a territory. And there was a push to bring in settlers.
In 1854, Territorial Governor Isaac Stevens made treaties with all the Indians in Washington. In return, they were to receive payments and were promised that they and their descendants would always have the right to fish in their usual and accustomed ground.
Well, a century later, as more and more people moved into the Northwest, the salmon became, particularly salmon, but really all species, began to be under much pressure, and growth and urban development and all those things were wiping out the salmon. But the first group to really feel it was those who had been living off subsistence for centuries.
One thing is different than it used to be. Now when they set their nets in the evening, the game wardens sit and watch from the other side of the river.
The states of Washington, Oregon, and Idaho went out of their way to crack down on fishing by Native Americans. In fact, when I was a kid and I grew up in Idaho, I remember salmon fishing with my dad, and at one point he said, I'm probably going to get arrested, so go back to the camp and get everything organized. And because law enforcement was seen on the side of anti-fishing, there was a lot of civil disobedience, particularly starting in the 1960s and 70s, with fish-ins and other demonstrations to say, hey, wait a minute, we have a treaty.
In 1968, the Survival Organization enlisted the support of sympathetic young people to help keep a 24-hour guard on the nets of the Indian fishermen, because if the nets and boats were unguarded, they would be stolen by fisherymen.
The state would come in and not only cut up the fish nets, but basically beat up people.
we decided we would put our boats on the opposite side of the river. When we went across the river, they started throwing clubs, and so we had to bring in our full force and arrest anyone who had resisted.
So that it was about as tense as you could get in terms of pushing it. And like anyone with civil disobedience, Billy Frank and Hank Adams were always trying to push. They wanted the government to respond. They wanted to get people arrested. They wanted to be able to use that as a mechanism to highlight that injustice.
Well, we don't plan only to fish. We also plan some legal maneuvers to carry the issues in certain courts and as high as we can go.
And it finally made its way to the Supreme Court in what's now known as the Bolt decision. And the Supreme Court not only affirmed the right of tribes, but they took the language from the treaties and said that tribes have to be protected in the way of the language. And the language that was in particular was in common with. And the Supreme Court read that to say half the salmon. Of course, tribes never have come anywhere near half the salmon. But what it did do was set this really remarkable regulatory structure, making tribes and the states work together. And I really believe now, when you look back at it, that one thing is what saved salmon in the Pacific Northwest.
So those fish wars, they led into the Bolt decision, 1974. There's a federal judge, George Bolt, rules in favor of the tribes, reaffirms their fishing rights. Now, you have called this the best example of Hank Adams' genius. Can you tell me exactly what you mean by that?
Sure. Well, Hank, one, had incredible research resources. He probably had as much as any archive, and he would disappear into his archive and come back with documents that said, this is what it says. He also set up, and this is his strategy, started meeting with George Bolt. Really not something you would expect as a straight-on assault, but more, let's build a relationship with each other first and see where this goes. George Bolt relied on him in a really extraordinary way. He was the non-lay representative, and he was actually the last person to testify at the trial, and was treated with deference throughout the process because the judge understood his deep understanding of the history and the significance of a subsistence fishery.
Hank Adams plays a really particular role in this history. He's done so much to impact not just tribal rights, but tribes all over the country. Why do you think he was not more well-known?
Well, he didn't want to be well-known. He, in fact, it's funny. Over the years, I've tried to interview him, and we have a family relationship, so I even pressed that, and it really never worked. The one time I had a formal interview with Hank was I called Billy Frank and said, I need to talk to Hank. And so Billy said, well, come down, we'll do it together. And so it became a three-way interview, and that was really the only formal way I could do it. He really liked being in the background, and he liked coming up with documents. I covered a Supreme Court hearing on the Herrera case, which is another hunting and fishing rights case last year in the Supreme Court. And in that case, Judge Gorsuch gets a lot of credit for supporting the tribe's point of view. But in Hank's mind, he didn't go far enough. He didn't want to reverse this one decision from the 18th century that was really terrible. And so Hank wrote me a 14-page letter about what the judge missed.
So when we speak of the fish wars, civil disobedience, considering Hank Adams, what do you think his lesson is for us today?
Well, to me, and maybe this is the journalist in me speaking, is do your research. I mean, there's so many really great stories that have roots, that have deep, deep roots, and you need to follow those all the way to get a full picture of what's going on. And when you got a note from Hank, it was always detailed, and it always went back at least 100 years, but often even more than that. And when you think about the tribes in this region, particularly today, thinking about that 10,000 plus year history, I think is really important because it shows a lot of the challenges we face are something that people have gone through before.
Thanks for listening to Seattle Now. And thanks to Dyer Oxley for filling in. The show is produced by Clare McGrane, Caroline Chamberlain Gomez, and Jason Pagano. Today's show was produced by Matt Martin. Matt Jorgensen does our music. And I'm Patricia Murphy. See you tomorrow.